West Texas town of El Paso, I fell in love with a Mexican girl. Nighttime would find me in Rosa's cantina, music would play and Valina would whirl. Blacker than night were the eyes of Valina, wicked and evil while casting a spell. My love was deep for this Mexican maiden, I was in love but in vain I could tell. One night a wild young cowboy came in, wild as the West Texas wind. Dashing and daring, a drink he was sharing with wicked Felina, the girl that I love.
El Paso, Texas, Saturday, 16 October 1909, 10:30 a.m. The President of the United States, William Howard Taft, and the President of Mexico, José de la Cruz Porfirio Díaz, have just greeted one another at the El Paso train station. They are being conveyed through the city in an open carriage on the way to the Chamizal Strip, a 600-acre piece of disputed territory on the banks of the Rio Grande that has been temporarily declared neutral territory for the purposes of this, the first ever bilateral summit between the heads of state of the U.S. and Mexico. As the carriage and its military escort passed the El Paso Chamber of Commerce building, a mentally deranged 52-year-old lunatic from Minneapolis, Minnesota, by the name of Julius Bergerson inches through the crowds lining the side of the parade route, and as the carriage passes in front of him, as he has an unobstructed line of sight of less than 6 feet, he begins to raise the small pistol that he's concealed in the sleeve of his jacket, a pistol he intends to use to assassinate both President Taft and President Diaz. At the very last moment, converging on the would-be assassin from opposite sides, Private C.R. Moore of Company A of the Texas Rangers and the world-famous scout and adventurer Frederick Russell Burnham, who is there that day as part of a private security detail, each of whom has separately noticed this Bergerson fellow acting rather suspiciously. They gang tackle that son of a bitch and prevent him from making good on the attempted double murder. In the whole gruesome pantheon of presidential assassinations, both the 4 successful ones and the numerous unsuccessful ones, this might be the most important one that you've likely never heard of before. It's Thursday, the 16th of October, the 116th anniversary of the event in question. This is Curmudgeon's Corner. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where I have got the best archers and pikemen in the whole kingdom running my security detail. Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to Curmudgeon's Corner. Let's talk about the Taft-Diaz summit meeting of 16 October 1909. As with all such bilateral diplomatic shindigs, each president has a specific political objective that he seeks to achieve. For President Taft, he's only been in office for 9 months. He's just replaced the wildly popular Theodore Roosevelt, who opted not to run for re-election in 1908, even though he had every right to do so, because remember, even though he's been president for nearly 8 years, he has only been elected once in his own right, because for the first 4 years, he was finishing out McKinley's second term after McKinley was assassinated, and that, of course, was a decision that he would come to regret. And the country would come to regret it too, because the net result of that whole thing was that we wound up with 8 years of Woodrow Wilson as president, and just about every systemic problem that continues to afflict us here in the present day can be traced directly back to the Woodrow Wilson era. So in October of 1909, Taft knows he is living in the shadow of Roosevelt, and he doesn't want to live in the shadow of Roosevelt. So he wants to start building up his own portfolio as a diplomat and a statesman, and he hopes a summit meeting with the President of Mexico will help him do that. He is also under pressure from the American industrialists who are making a hell of a lot of money down in Mexico to safeguard their interests. As the two leaders convene in El Paso, U.S. companies control around 90% of Mexico's mineral resources and its national railroad and its oil industry and a great deal of its land. For Porfirio Díaz, he's 80 years old in 1909. He's been the Mexican president for most of the past 30 years, and he wants to keep being the Mexican president. He's just recently announced his intention to run for a 7th term in 1910, and a lot of people in Mexico aren't very happy about that. They view him as a corrupt, self-enriching stooge of various foreign powers, both American and European, and they are not entirely wrong in that assessment. Diaz hopes he can get the support of the U.S. government in his run for a 7th term if he convinces President Taft that, look, if I'm still in power, I will make sure all these American companies can continue to operate without interference, even though there are revolutionary elements in my country that would very much like to kick out the gringos and nationalize all of the industrial and commercial infrastructure that you guys have built over the course of the past several decades. And the other thing on the table is both countries would like to negotiate a permanent settlement on the status of the Chamizal Strip, which has been a point of binational contention ever since back in the 1860s. It sounds easy enough to say the Rio Grande is the border between the United States and Mexico, but in the years between 1864 and 1901, you had a few different flood events that changed where the course of the river actually was. It created new bends and meanders, the result of which was that people who lived in the U.S. last week now found themselves living in Mexico, and vice versa. So there was common agreement on both sides that, at least in this one small area, we probably need to have the delineation between the two countries be based on geographic coordinates and not where the course of the river happens to be in any given year. And it's decided that they're going to hold the Taft-Diaz summit meeting in the Chamizal Strip itself, and for the duration of the conference, we will declare it neutral territory, and neither country's flag will be flown for the duration of the proceedings. So the plan they decide on is Diaz will cross the border into El Paso, becoming the first Mexican president to set foot in the United States. He will meet Taft at the train station. They will process through the city. Then they'll cross over the border into Juarez City, with Taft thus becoming the first U.S. president to set foot in Mexico. Then they will process through that city, and then they will proceed to the Chamizal Strip and get down to the nitty-gritty of the bilateral negotiations. But tensions are high. The security situation is decidedly non-ideal. There have been a large number of threats received on both sides of the border against the lives of both presidents. So you had a wide variety of agencies on hand from both governments to provide security, up to and including the Texas Rangers, the U.S. Army, the Mexican Army, the U.S. Secret Service, the Bureau of Investigation, the precursor of the FBI, the U.S. Marshals, and the 250-man private security detail under the command of the aforementioned Frederick Russell Burnham. And even with that unprecedented allocation of manpower, they've got the two presidents riding in an open carriage, and a maniac with a pistol manages to get within 6 feet of them. And only by the grace of Providence and the decisive actions of Private Moore and Mr. Burnham was a tragedy averted whose consequences might have rung down through the ages. On the Mexican side, let's be honest, it might not have made much difference if Porfirio Díaz was assassinated in 1909, since in the actual event, he declared himself the winner of a clearly fraudulent election in 1910. You know, one of those Saddam Hussein-style elections where the president goes, "Look, I got 99.2% of the vote. Clearly the people love me and they want me to rule forever." After which he was quickly deposed and exiled to Spain, where he died 5 years later, and Mexico descends into a decade-long state of lawless anarchy that they now refer to as the Mexican Revolution. Such a state of lawless anarchy, in fact, that Pancho Villa and his gang of thugs and bandits become the de facto rulers of northern Mexico, much like today's drug cartel savages. And they are so emboldened that they begin conducting raids across the border into the United States, including the attack on Columbus, New Mexico on the 9th of March 1916, in which 37 U.S. Army personnel and 20 civilians are killed, which results in President Wilson sending General Pershing and a 10,000-man detachment into Mexico to exact military vengeance in what came to be known as the Punitive Expedition of 1916, or the Pancho Villa Expedition, if you prefer, the most famous episode of which was when Lieutenant George Patton led the first motorized assault in the history of human warfare, and he comes back to base with the carcasses of 3 of Pancho Villa's men strapped across the hood of his Dodge touring car. Was George Patton a stone-cold badass? Yes. Yes, he was. Now, you might be surprised to learn that nobody was very interested in why Julius Bergerson wanted to kill President Taft. The Secret Service went up to Minnesota, they interviewed his neighbors and his associates, and they all confirmed, yeah, he hated Taft. He wanted to kill him. He was talking about it for months. Wouldn't shut up about it. Texas tried to put him on trial for the attempted assassination, but the judge ruled, nah, this guy is stark raving mad. He is nutty as a fruitcake. We can't put this maniac on trial. So they shipped him back to Minneapolis, stuck him in a lunatic asylum, threw away the damn key, and he was forgotten about to such an extent that it's not even certain what year he died or where he was buried. But American history might have taken a decidedly different course if he had succeeded in murdering President Taft on that Saturday in El Paso in 1909. Why do I say that? First and foremost, I say it because Taft's vice president was James S. Sherman of New York, former 8-term congressman. Obviously, if Taft had been assassinated on 16 October 1909, James Sherman would have been duly sworn in as the 28th president of the United States. But here's where things get complicated. You know why? because James Sherman was diagnosed with Bright's disease in 1904, and by the time he becomes vice president in 1909, he is already in failing health. He is renominated as Taft's running mate in 1912, but he dies 1 week before the election at the age of 57. And remember, this is the same election where Theodore Roosevelt, who lamented his decision not to run again in 1908, he ran as a third-party candidate for the Bull Moose Party in 1912 after he tried to primary Taft for the Republican nomination, the net result of which was that the Republicans split their vote between Taft and Roosevelt, and into the White House waltzes Woodrow Wilson, the disastrous effects of whose presidency are still being felt by every American every day here in the third decade of the 21st century. But what happens if Taft gets assassinated in 1909? Sherman becomes the president, obviously, but it's hard to picture the Republicans choosing him as their nominee in 1912 when he was in failing health and only had months to live. And while I would never suggest that a president not being assassinated was a tragedy for the country, it's also difficult to avoid the conclusion that had this assassination attempt been successful, there would have been absolutely nothing standing between Theodore Roosevelt and the 1912 Republican nomination, which means there is never any Woodrow Wilson presidency. And that is why, in the judgment of this reporter, the failed assassination attempt by Julius Bergerson upon President William Howard Taft on Saturday, 16 October 1909 might have been the most consequential event in the history of the 20th century. I'm done. That's all I've got. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Get off my lawn.